Welcome to the James Bond Book Club. Hosted by me, John Bleasdale. Hello everybody and welcome to the James Bond Book Club. My name is Bleasdale, John Bleasdale, and I'm delighted to be joined by Lowbridge-Ellis David. David? Wait a minute, have I done that right? Lowbridge-Ellis.
David Lowbridge-Ellis. There you go.
I'm not sure how often that's gonna survive, that idea of introducing people in that way. David, thanks for joining
I enjoyed
me.
it, John. No. Thank you for having me. Anyone who listens to me on podcasts might be thinking he sounds a bit different. I'm currently fighting off a cold, so if I sound a little bit deeper than normal, that's the reason why. But very, very happy to be here.
And you are, of course, the co-host. The co-host, is that correct?
I'm the creator and editor of Licensed to Queer. My husband has taken on increasing duties with regards to the social media side of things, and he created a podcast that we put out through Licensed to Queer about the James Bond comics. So but beyond my family, I have lots of kind of co-creators, collaborators on the Licensed to Queer platform. Now that it's gone from, in 4 years, it's gone from being a website where I was just kind of putting down in words the weird thoughts about James Bond that have been going around in my head for basically a lifetime, to being a podcast, to being a YouTube channel, and it's on Instagram and Twitter. And so, yes, it's a mini empire at the moment, Licensed to Queer. So, but have you got your
own layer?
My own layer.
You know, like a Bond villain with his own, or is it more like
department? Well, I kind of split podcasting duties between the room I'm in now and then the book room upstairs. So I suppose the top and bottom floors of our house are my Bond layer. Nothing as ostentatious as a volcano or a underwater Atlantis type base or something. Not yet, anyway. That's the next phase of the world domination plan.
And you've been involved as well in the publication of some books related to Bond and the Ian Fleming publications, correct?
Yeah, I've supported the release of several books through Ian Fleming publications. Sometimes behind the scenes, sometimes front and center. Like I hosted the launch of Spy Like Me. If listeners have not heard of those books, the brilliant author Kim Sherwood is writing a series of Bond books that sort of don't have James Bond in, but do have James Bond because everyone keeps talking about him. But there's this really interesting cast of other 00 characters, which is something I've wanted for years and years and years. And so I love that series of books. So it's been really great to get to know Kim and to support Ian Fleming Publications in launching those books. Yeah.
One of the first times I sort of came across a queer reading of James Bond was Jeanette Winterson wrote an essay, I think for The Guardian a while back, and it was kind of like, was that an influence?
You know what? It wasn't. The thing that led me to do what I do is because I was actually frustrated that there weren't enough queer people putting stuff out there about Bond. I have subsequently read Jeanette Winterson's piece, and I'm a massive Jeanette Winterson fan, so I don't know how I missed it when it was originally published. I think it was about 15, 20 years ago. But it's a brilliant piece. If anyone's never read that piece by Winterson, it's so funny. And she does capture a lot of the queer appeal of James Bond. But it's really interesting. I've obviously interacted with many, many queer James Bond fans who, to be perfectly honest, didn't really have a platform until I started doing what I do, or at least there wasn't a way to kind of bring people together, but they were kind of all kind of off sort of doing their own thing. But it's really interesting to hear all the different perspectives. And there's not one kind of just, I started off with the mission of trying to explain why James Bond appeals so much to LGBTQ plus people, because on the surface, it appears to be the least queer friendly thing. And then you just dig even very slightly beneath that surface and you find all of these queer Bond fans and they all have their points of view. And so that's why I wanted to create the Licensed to Queer platform, to enable those points of view to to kind of have their time in the spotlight.
I think that's also interesting in terms of the book we're going to look at today, Live and Let
Mm,
Die, because obviously on the surface, there is a lot that you might find reprehensible in this book and you might want to push away
mhm,
from and maybe even say, okay, let's just not go there. But I actually find that the attitudes towards race, the attitudes toward that are changing, kind of
mhm,
fascinating. And I think if we just
mhm.
dismiss it purely as racist, then we're kind of missing a glimpse of a really interesting historical moment.
I agree. And Live and Let Die, I'll say up front now, the reason when you asked me which book I'd be interested in talking about, and I think I gave you a list of about 8 of them out of the 14, and I was just like, okay, please just pick one, John. But I'm really glad that you picked Live and Let Die because it is one of my top 3 Fleming Bond books. And for my money, I think it's the most exciting James Bond book. And tied in with what you were just saying, I think it's really exciting because James Bond, perhaps more than any other Bond story, spends so much time feeling like an outsider to the rest of society. And actually, kind of, I think there's a lot of empathy for outsiders in this book. Yes, there's a lot of stuff that we might loosely termed problematic in this book, including certain vocabulary, which was actually changed for the US edition because there were certain words, such as the N word, which were not palatable even when this book was originally released in the early 1950s. But I think this book actually does have an awful lot of empathy for outsiders, and Bond himself is constantly put in situations where he is on the outside looking into society. So I think that's part of the reason why this book is so exciting because he's constantly almost on edge and outside the rest of the societies that he's moving through.
And what's fascinating, so let's get down to the book itself,
Mm,
and so we can go through it as we're. I'm sure these
yeah.
issues will come up. So it starts in Idlewild Airport in New York, as it was then called. I think it's turned into JFK, didn't it?
I don't know if I've ever. Ooh, I'm not sure to be honest.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll leave that, and maybe I'll Wikipedia it later and drop in an authoritative voice saying this was not true or whatever. Um, And Bond is sort of in New York for a mission, and we're going to get what that mission is a little bit in flashback later. But right away, you get this idea that America is as foreign a country to Bond, in fact,
Hmm.
maybe even more foreign than
Hmm.
France was in Casino Royale.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this book starts off with Bond literally quoting Fleming here, playing the part of a rich man. So, there's that misconception that Bond always lives the high life. Actually, Bond is a fairly moderately salaried civil servant. And if he has any extra funds, it's because he wins them playing cards and easy come, easy go. He's not a rich man, so he's playing that part. And I love that part in the first chapter where he talks about losing his anonymity at security, and it says it makes him feel like someone who's had his shadow stolen by a witch doctor, which, so in a sense, and we'll come on to this, I'm sure, but all the stuff about voodoo in this book, James Bond doesn't look down on voodoo. He actually sort of has a healthy respect for other people's beliefs. And he almost feels, yeah, he can kind of put himself in other people's shoes quite a lot. But yeah, he's definitely a fish out of water in this story, and he's repeatedly put into those situations. And actually, I think there's a great amount of hubris in this book because Bond actually underestimates the effectiveness of the people who are working against him, and he's constantly brought up short, and he even has to do some exercise and train to be able to defeat the villain, which is rare for Bond. He actually has to take this. He realizes 2/3 of the way through the book how seriously he needs to take these villains, and he's completely underestimated them. Which is, again, I think, a reason why this book is just so darn exciting.
Remarkably, he kind of learns a new skill. He goes like, okay, now I
Mm,
need to, and he stops drinking. He stops
I
drinking
know.
for like a
A
period,
week?
and
A week?
he has a
James Bond
week.
not having a drink for a week? What?
He doesn't get the DTs or anything. It's
Hmm?
amazing. I think he has his first cigarette the morning of the mission. And it's like a delicious cigarette that he has.
Life-giving cigarette. Exactly.
I love those descriptions. Nobody likes smoking as much as Ian Fleming. You can
No,
tell from
no.
the pros. This idea that he's a fish out of water, and the fact that was it Bill Bryson or somebody who said that the English and the Americans are two people separated by a common language. That when he arrives at the hotel and he meets Felix Leiter and the other heads of the various sort of law enforcement agencies that he's going to have to deal with, he kind of has to be trained to be an American, and that includes. And this is something that when I was reading, I thought this is amazing. He has to sort of wear a costume, a little bit like
Mm,
Mr. Ben. He has
mm.
to get a fedora hat and the whole like almost like an American private eye.
And wear really garish ties, which you can tell Bond really hates. So, if interestingly, although the story of Live and Let Die is not replicated in the film for the most part, in fact, more of the Live and Let Die book is replicated in the License to Kill film. There are lots of characters and things, but they're very different in both the book and the film. But one of the details that does survive into the film, which I always really enjoy, is Bond selecting ties in his New York hotel room. In the film, though, he turns down the really garish ties, whereas in the book he goes for them. And one of the most interesting bits of this book, I think, is when he and Leiter get dressed up to go to Harlem, and it's almost like they have to wear slightly more garish, or what's a better word? Well, vibrant clothing, because they kind of need to blend in. And in the film version, the only kind of real, you do have Bond being a fish out of water when he goes to the Filet au Sol restaurant in Upper Manhattan. But there's that really great line in the film, isn't there? It's like, white man in Harlem, great disguise, Bond. But he and Felix don't get out of trouble quite so easily in the book version, because they do sort of attempt to blend in, but do a really bad job of it.
And yeah, as you say, there's a sense of hubris. They're kind of from the minute they arrive in New York,
Mm,
there's this network of people, and I think that speaks for the very first time to a paranoia
mm,
that there is what Margaret Thatcher would call an enemy from within, that
mm,
all black people might be tied up, and
mm.
using them in this sort of service industry kind of way is a major vulnerability, because you rely on them for everything. So train porters and everybody will be part of Mr. Big's criminal network.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, from a modern point of view, it is quite uncomfortable at times, because it is, essentially, if it's a black person, don't trust them. That's the world that's set up at the start of this book. It does give the book a sense of really impending doom, and I think I think Fleming's writing is so amazing in this book in so many different ways, but particularly the way he creates that sense of impending doom. But I think it's probably too easy to write it off as just xenophobia, because as I mentioned a little while ago, it's Bond has a respect for other people's beliefs. So when he starts talking about voodoo later on to Solitaire, he's saying, I know what fear can do to people. I've read most of the books on voodoo and I believe it works. I don't think it would work on me, because I stopped believing it, being afraid of the dark when I was a child, but I shan't laugh at it. The scientists and doctors who wrote the books don't laugh at it. He does have that sort of healthy respect. And I think, in a sense, Fleming wants us to buy into that sense of doom and that sense of fear, even if we as rational people, I don't believe in voodoo. But I read this book and I could kind of almost start, while I'm reading it, start believing in voodoo. Even though you can kind of see how that fear is being created and manipulated by Mr. Big. I think Fleming does really, within the pages of this book, I think he does kind of help us almost believe.
And there is a sense that it reminded me of in Goodfellas, when Henry Hill says, people don't know what the mafia is. It's the cops
Mm.
for people who can't go to the cops. And I
Mm.
got the feeling here, look, if you're not going to let us in society as equal members, then we're going to go to an alternative civil service. We're going to go to an
Hmm.
alternative. And that sort of more complicated view on race, and I'm in no way saying
Mm.
that this is sort of like not racist or
No.
doesn't have, as you say, racist overtones or problematic overtones.
Mm.
But one of the examples of like an exception to or a complication of that is the way Felix Leiter isn't tortured. They're both captured. In a really horrible scene, James Bond has his finger broken, which is
Yeah,
excruciating. I don't know why that hurts so much to read, but it really does.
does.
But Leiter gets away because of a shared enthusiasm, knowledgeable enthusiasm for jazz.
Yeah, and you could say that I'm not sure how we'd analyze that really, but it is almost like because there were a lot of white intellectuals who spent a long time in, if anyone knows anything about the Harlem Renaissance in the early 20th century, it was a hangout for some of Fleming's friends, incidentally. People like Noel Coward frequented Harlem quite a lot. So yeah, it's not an excuse at all here, but at the same time, there is almost I think really even Bond has a sort of Fleming's trying to convince us that Bond has an affinity for anyone who is not the dominant culture. So constantly throughout this book, there's references to scars as well. So Bond is obviously scarred, and that's one of my top things for whoever the new James Bond is. I want them to have a scar, please, and that marks him out as different all the time throughout the story. Bond is constantly identified by the scar on his face, and I always find that fascinating.
That's so interesting. I never thought of that in the context of, for instance, Bond always gets criticized, the Bond books, I mean, for using disfigurement
Mm,
as a sign of villainy. But of course, in the books, disfigurement is part of the character. And I think it also speaks to something I noticed as I reread recently Casino Royale, is the proximity of the Second World War here. People are recently scarred, recently
hmm.
traumatized. And that's the other thing in the context of Live and Let Die. He's visiting a country where the Second World War wasn't, with the exception of Pearl Harbor, wasn't on its own territory, wasn't
Mm.
fought on its own territory.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's particularly these early books, they very much are tied with the Second World War experiences. And if we're talking about scars as well, there's the opening chapter has Bond. I think it's very early towards the start anyway. But Bond has had to have plastic surgery on his hand because obviously he had Smearspionums scraped into his hand at the end of Casino Royale. That immediately sets up this story being a revenge story. And when I reread it for this, I'd forgotten quite how clearly that's stated. So Bond really has it in for Smersh specifically, even though it's actually a Smersh agent who saved his life, at the end of Casino Royale, and then marked him and effectively turned him into a useless man. So if we think about people coming back from the Second World War who maybe had been injured, Bond has that injury in Casino Royale, about 7, 8 years ago after the Second World War. I'm thinking now as we're talking whether that's almost supposed to be analogous with the experiences of war veterans and actually, buoying them up and saying, well, just because you are injured, disfigured, whatever, doesn't mean that you can't have a purpose.
What I love as well about that, because injuries to hands come up in the book as well. Of course, he has
Mm-hmm.
his hand
Mm-hmm.
injured, as we've just mentioned. But I like the way Fleming he's good at remembering stuff. I mean, that injury plays a role throughout, an action sequence later on where he tries to
Mm-hmm.
break into the aquarium sort of fish marketplace that Mr. Big is running as he's smuggling through.
Mm.
Um, and he can't shoot straight. He can't, he's can't hold a gun and do something else at the same time. So it sort of plays a role. The actual mission is really interesting as well, because the mission strikes me, especially when you compare it to the films where the mission seems to be always save the world. The mission is just like somebody's stealing pirate treasure, and it's like such a boy's own adventure for the whole the MacGuffin and the whole impetus of the novel.
This is probably it's such a contrast with Casino Royale. This is like Fleming's foray into fantasy, which he does a few times through the series. So Doctor No is probably the clearest example of where Fleming goes into fantasy mode. But there's as well as being like a pirate adventure story, very much the last third, and as Bond and Emma talking during the briefing scene about Bloody Morgan and all that stuff, Blackbeard and all that stuff is really
Bloody
exciting.
Morgan sounds like they're just exasperated with him.
Yeah, I know. As I said it, I thought, I'm not swearing, folks. That was the name of a pirate. But there's also lots of horror elements to this story. And there's some absolutely stunning descriptions by Fleming, particularly when they're on the train, of how eerie everything is outside the window. You've got Bond thought that nothing could be living in these forests except bats and scorpions, horned toads and black widow spiders. It's really spooky at times, this story. And so it is almost like a pirate horror adventure story. And I think that's probably why I like it so much, because even though I think it's probably quite clear to listeners already, what I said about voodoo. I'm a complete rationalist, probably too much for my own good, to be honest. Don't believe in ghosts or anything like that. I love this story because it just comes to that world where these things could be possible.
Yeah, and there's a sense as well that there's a sort of gothicness to it. There's a grand guignol, and later on when the violence comes up, or even midway through when the violence comes up, you've got torture, people tied to things, people being eaten by things. And Umberto Eco used Live and Let Die as an example of, I mean, he compared Fleming to Marquis de Sade and highlighted this sort of gothic sensibility that you can see throughout the book. So we have Mr. Big as a character. Let's talk a little bit about him, because I love the fact that his name is an acronym as well. Is acronym the right word, where his initials make big? So it's
that would be an acronym, wouldn't it? Yeah, and rather than initialism, people always get those mixed around. But if you say it as a word, it's an acronym. That's the one.
Excellent. Good. I'm glad about that. I'm glad I have shown myself up. I mean, he's interesting because, of course, there are elements of he's this huge intellectual sort of Moriarty figure. He's grotesque physically. There's this sort of sense. And there's also, he's a threefold threat, really. There's a supernatural. He's described as grayish and like a zombie and huge. There's the spy element. He is an agent for Smersh. And there's the criminal mastermind element, that he is his own sort of has his own network, and he has his own sort of mafia and everything. So he sort of has this great. I think he's a wonderful villain. I think he's definitely a development from Le Chiffre, who is just described as basically a grotesque opportunist.
I actually think Mr. Biggie is my favorite villain in all of Fleming. There are some of the villains of the short stories are really great. So I really love to hate Milton Crest in the short story, The Hildebrandt Rarity, for instance. But he's very realistic. I suppose out of the grotesques, Mr. Big is definitely my favorite. And I think you can see shades of him in so many of the later villains, like Auric Goldfinger. For me, he's not as strong. It's like Goldfinger is a great character, but it's like a slightly weaker version of Mr. Big. And you're right, he's kind of got the physical abnormalities, like he's the grey pallor of his skin and all of that. But it's actually when he and Bond come face to face on his island later on, and I love all that dialogue. It's the first Bond villain to suffer from Akidi. I'm never quite sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but the lethal lethargy that's brought on by inaction, that Bond himself suffers from, and of course Ian Fleming too, and Goldfinger actually as well, and another of the villains too. But yeah, I find him absolutely compelling, and actually genuinely quite terrifying. I think he's a great creation.
Yeah, he's really got that, and there are so many aspects of his character and his status which will find themselves in the movies and be influenced. He has
Hmm.
the gun under the table, which
Hmm.
comes up in Spy Who Loved Me,
Yeah.
and as you say, there are elements where I sort of think with every Bond villain, there have got to be certain consistencies. There's a certain Blofeldness to him as
Mm.
well, but yeah, I think he has this uniqueness which is really compelling. Um, so Mr. Big also has that thing of timing his appearance. So he appears very early on in
Yeah.
the book, and then right at the end, and sort of does everything else through lieutenants, and that allows him or lieutenants, as James Bond would then phonetically spell as a way of saying, listen,
Yeah.
listen to how they pronounce it here. They're the crazy guys. Solitaire, of course, turns up early on as well as
Mm.
the sort of truth. One of the few bits of the film which kind of translates fairly faithfully from the book.
It does. There's a subtle difference, which, or maybe not so subtle, when Bond and Solitaire first meet. Bond is the one who manipulates Solitaire in the film. So he picks on, I'm sure listeners will remember in the film, he picks up the lover's card, presumably out of luck from the pack. Although Live and Let Die is the only James Bond film which actually does exist in a supernatural world, with Baron Samedi returning to life repeatedly. So there's maybe the film wants us to believe that tarot is actually, that tarot definitely is always accurate and everything. But but in the book, Solitaire is the one who actually has more agency, and she's the one who affects her to escape from Mr. Big, and essentially gives Bond a glance that he interprets correctly, that she signals to Bond her desire to escape. And also later on in the story, there is some criticism of Live and Let Die, the film, because essentially Bond tricks a woman into bed. It's the other way around in the book, as ever, and this is a really big difference between the films and the books. The women are usually far more proactive in the bedroom department than Bond is. So she's the one who she kissed him long and lasciviously, as if she was the man and he the woman. Gender in Fleming is always absolutely fascinating, as I've explored many times in the things that I've written over the years. And then she's the one who gets, spoiler alert, she's the one who gets completely naked when when Bond returns to their train compartment. And rather cruelly, going back to what you were saying about Bond's little finger, she realizes that that's going to hold things back, shall we say? But she knows exactly what she's doing the whole time through this story.
Which reminded me as well of Casino Royale with the
Mm-hmm.
new Daniel Craig film where he says, "Oh, but you don't know what I can do with my little
My little
finger."
finger, yeah.
Yeah. Great continuation. I love the way the films and the books sort of dance around each other and sort of little
Mm.
pieces and little quotes are dropped in, all over the sort of canon. Um, that train journey as well. I mean, this is Fleming doing his research. Fleming flies in with Anne, his wife, and they do that train journey and they fly over to Jamaica in order. I'm not sure if they're doing it specifically for that reason of research, but he's using all that information to then write the book. And this book was written, of course. Well, not of course necessarily, but this was written before Casino Royale was published. So it's before he knows whether this is going to be a success or not. So you can see that he's really thinking forward that this is something he's going to write as a series of books. So he's going to have this character is going to come back. When they get to Florida, here is a moment of real sort of, I feel like this is young Bond. This is Bond not quite at his most experienced or best. he always seems to make these very basic errors where it's sort of like, Solitaire saying, "No, don't leave me. I don't want to be left alone." It's like, what could possibly go wrong? And then deeply regrets it when she's immediately kidnapped and taken away in a radio box or something. I think that they're coming to.
Yeah,
This happens in Casino Royale as well. I think there's some like radio repairmen who turn up. I think Matisse turns up as a radio repairman at some point.
I love it when Bond makes mistakes because it does give him that vulnerability, and he makes a lot of mistakes in the Fleming stories. And particularly in this novel, and again, it goes back to what we were saying about underestimating the enemy. And not appreciating that they're absolutely everywhere. Leiter's just as bad. He goes off on his own to confront the robber, who is a brilliant character. There's not really a character like him in the films that I can think of. I know that sequence is where Bond does confront the robber is basically replicated in License to Kill, but that character doesn't really exist. And as with a lot of Fleming villains, he's cruel to animals. So one of my favorite chapters in all of Fleming is in this book. It's called Death of a Pelican because, again, spoiler alert, a pelican doesn't make its way to the end of the chapter. So if you want to make someone a villain in Fleming, have them kill animals completely needlessly. But Bond and Leiter underestimate him. And yeah, as you say, he leaves Solitaire alone because this is a sleepy Florida town where people basically come here to retire and then die. Nothing can possibly go wrong here. Oh, James.
Yeah, dear, oh dear. And the idea of Florida as a retirement community as well is kind of also interestingly gothic, that it has all these, they're going to restaurants and things and they're the youngest people there and these violent things are happening and nobody around. I just rewatched Scarface recently and the bit in the chainsaw when they come out, the Chainsaw Motel scene, when he comes out and executes the guy on the street, everybody coming out of the bars and everything, they're all old. And it's like no one's going to chase Tony Montana down the street. They're just retirees essentially. So we also get this flash of mordant humor. He disagreed with something that ate him. I mean, unbelievably funny and at the same time horrible and terrifying.
It's absolutely vile. And I remember, if we remember, this is only the second Bond novel, and Leiter is in Casino Royale, not quite as to the forefront as he is in this novel, but to actually kill off a character who you probably know you're going to have to keep using, particularly if you want to crack the American market, is quite a bold move from Fleming. So, we think he might be dead. He's not dead. And actually, he does make quite a significant recovery. But he is forever changed by the experience. And that's what propels us into the third act of the story as well. We've got that revenge motif right from the start, but then this is what really makes it personal for Bond, which is again why I think License to Kill is the film which is far closer to the book than Live and Let Die, because of that revenge thread all the way through. But yeah, that scene. I don't know if you ever read there was a comic book adaptation, a graphic novel adaptation, which was brilliantly faithful to Fleming. And that sequence where Bond discovers Fleming discovers Felix's body on the bed with a sheet completely covering him, and he's wrapped up in bandages is terrifying when actually visualized, and Fleming's description of it is really unnerving. And then, as you say, you've got that really mordant humor. You've got even the title. Let's just think the title of this book is Live and Let Die, and Bond references the adage at the beginning, live and let live. Fleming always liked to play with death. And undercut any kind of seriousness. Well, I suppose it is serious, but undercut any kind of pomposity maybe around death by kind of seeing the funny side. And I think that's definitely a quality that I always enjoy.
And it's also, it's that live and let live is about tolerance and,
Mm.
and getting along with your neighbor and not, and it's sort of like, no. I mean, it's not necessarily antithetical to it because it's let die, it's not live and let kill.
I love that part on the air, tied in with that. I love that part of the in where Bond's on the airplane. And Bond is always a nervous flyer.
Mm.
Bear in mind, this is in the 1950s when commercial flights were probably not as safe as they are today. And I think there have been some high profile plane crashes, but Bond is always a nervous passenger on a plane. And he always has to escape into in the novel of From Russia with Love, he escapes into his hurricane room inside himself to kind of deal with the anxiety of a plane being of a turbulent flight. But there's that brilliant sequence where basically Bond accepts he might die in the next minute, you know, and it's like, so take it easy, light a cigarette, and be grateful you are still alive as you suck the smoke deep into your lungs. I mean, that sentence is hilarious in hindsight about, the health, as we've already mentioned, the health giving benefits of smoking. But that idea that your stars have already let you come quite a long way since you left your mother's womb. Perhaps they'll even let you get to Jamaica tonight. There's that kind of resignation of, I might die in the next few seconds or I might live.
It's so funny that we think of him as such a daredevil and
No?
so dangerous, but in this he's so human. And
Mm,
I'm so glad you brought up that sequence because that page to me read that was the bit where the novel, and I don't think you need to make any apology for a book being a thriller or a genre piece or anything else, but it almost like got to literary status of this is
totally.
really profound. This is really fascinating how this adventurer suddenly has this internal monologue, this soliloquy almost, about just the arbitrary nature of existence.
I think you're right. And I think I've always argued for Fleming being literature. When I was at university and doing my English degree, I always slipped Fleming into the odd essay and kind of thought, oh, I've got away with it again, because Fleming probably didn't have the same literary status he did 20 years ago that he does now. But there are some other really great touches in this book, not just, as I've said, the really kind of gothic descriptions of so much of the train journey. I love all the stuff about Bond keeping his life compartmentalized.
Mm.
So as he's falling for solitaire, he has to, which I know is kind of a thriller trope, but I think this book probably kind of did a lot to make that a trope. Of he has to kind of keep his affections for solitaire on one side of the compartment and his professional life on another side of the compartment. But I think that provides a really great tension through this book and kind of a psychological realism to it, which has been endlessly copied since. But I think this was probably a very early, very successful attempt to do that.
I just want to skip back 1 second before we arrive in Jamaica.
Mm,
Somebody, I'm not going to claim credit for this. Somebody mentioned on Twitter that in the License to Kill novelization,
mm-hmm.
the scene where Leiter gets eaten by a shark, they decide to keep it consistent.
Canon.
And
Mm-hmm.
so it's like, what are the chances this could happen again to the
Not
same
again.
man? I'm being
Yeah.
eaten by a shark again.
I know. Yeah, John Gardner decided that because in his world, in Gardner's Bond books, Fleming, I keep saying that Felix appears so frequently, and he always has the disability that he's given as a result of this encounter with the shark. So yeah, he does. He has another shark encounter. She's incredibly bad luck.
We land in Jamaica, and of course, this is where the book is written. Fleming's home, Goldeneye, and a lot of the sort of flora and fauna in Jamaica are beautifully described and described in detail, which is sort of great as well because you get a real
Mm,
feeling of the sort of richness and wealth of life.
mm,
Sometimes I read, I don't know, a Lee Child thriller or something, and you sort of wonder, well, what's the point in living in this world anyway?
mm.
If it's just hotels and small town America and this and that, and there's no real appreciation of the world around you. But here you get a real sense that life is a wonderful thing, is a sensual, sensuous. experience. And of course, we meet also a couple of characters who are going to turn up in future Bond books. We meet Strangways and Quarrel,
Yep.
and Quarrel is kind of, again, here you go with a little bit of a trope, perhaps, of the black guy who is there. It's like the black sergeant in an American 70s cop show to show that the cop show isn't racist because look, the lieutenant is black or the sergeant is black.
And you could argue this even goes back to something like Robinson Crusoe. So you've got Man Friday. That's the character's name, isn't it? It's been 20 years since I read Robinson Crusoe, but yeah. But actually, yeah, I agree with you totally. It is a trope of fiction for the sidekick to be not the main hero of the story. And you could even argue that with Felix Leiter. So I have a whole thesis about Felix Leiter being the feminized version of Bond because he's not the main character in the story. And that's certainly the case in Live and Let Die. That keeps coming up again and again and again. You've definitely got that, psychic quality to Quarrel, but actually it's also based on reality. So Fleming himself had a friendship with someone who essentially taught him how to, dive and go diving with him and identify the different fish and everything like that. So that Quarrel is based loosely on a real life relationship that Fleming had while living in Jamaica.
And so there is also a sense that we're talking about black people, maybe in too uniform a sense. Mr.
Yeah.
Big is an American. He's had a certain experience, and Quarrel is West Indian and has a different experience, and within that, all seen, of course, through the eyes of Ian Fleming and to some degree James Bond as a character as well. There's also a sense of the old empire looking at the new empire, and Bond refers to leaving America as El Dorado, and there's this sort of patrician contempt for the
New money.
exactly, yeah, the nouveau riche and their. And this is the point at which Bond goes through what you said. If it was a mid-80s movie, it would be the training montage.
Yeah.
Team America style.
I love it though, because it's just as much psychological as it is physical. I know you could even argue that for a film like, I love the film Rocky, that whole series actually, even the one with the weird robot. But it's that he really does have to go through it psychologically as well as physically. So I'm long to see in a Bond film a prominent role played by Barracuda, because to my mind, Fleming at least describes them as being absolutely far more terrifying than sharks. And I know sharks maim or kill people quite a lot in this book as well. But Bond has that nightmare. He wakes up sweating. He basically has a panic attack because he's having nightmares about sharks and stingrays and barracuda. And it's just as much that he's got to kind of overcome that mental barrier just as much he has. He's actually got to do, as I said earlier, he's got to actually do some exercise for a change, because James Bond is, something of a Superman. He does have his vulnerabilities, but he basically usually does a few press ups. But here he actually has to do some strength training, and he really that scene where he and I can't deny its homoerotic quality, to be perfectly honest, but where Quarrel gives Bond a massage. But
why would you want to? Why would you want to?
I know we can't really
struggle against yourself.
let's. I was trying not to throw the spotlight on it too much, but there is a scene where Bond's muscles are all aching and Quarrel just has to rub him down, essentially. Bond actually has massages from men a lot in Fleming. He has one in Casino Royale as well, which, I'm sure there's, I might be stretching here, I don't know, but here it's definitely got a homoerotic quality to it. But there is a real sense that Bond is having to take this extremely seriously. And I think the first 2/3 of the book set that up really well, because he's constantly underestimated the villains. And it's a bit like I know you're a massive fan of the Leone Dollars trilogy as well, but when inevitably Clint Eastwood gets caught by the villains, and then like in Fistful of Dollars, he has to train to, his hands are damaged. He has to train how to use a gun again. It's very much like that narrative trajectory.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a sense that he needs to come. He's not up to snuff. He needs to get
No.
match fit, and it's almost as if what I loved about this final sort of act of the book is that the swim to the layer feels as
Mm,
adventurous as any confrontation when he gets
mm.
there. It's sort of like I've got to get there. That's the hard part. Once I've planted the limpet mine, then kind of mission accomplished, and surviving is a relatively unimportant thing. I've sort of done what I want to do, and then hopefully I'll rescue Solitaire and everything. But that almost doesn't matter because Mr. Big will die.
That Valley of Shadows, chapter 19, I think, in the book, that Valley of Shadows chapter where it's Bond, the whole chapter is Bond underwater, being dragged to the bottom of the ocean so he can walk along the. So I can't help picturing that scene in Pinocchio where Pinocchio, walks along the bottom of the ocean searching for the monstro. And it's very much like that, he's almost like talking to the fish at times, but then he gets an encounter with an octopus, and then it's also more scary things lunging out of the dark, and particularly barracuda. As someone who doesn't like going underwater very much, I find that chapter absolutely harrowing to read.
Yeah, the octopus particularly is and of course all of this is in the context of kind of it's a sort of thing that is only recently coming into people's consciousnesses because Jacques Cousteau, his first documentaries are coming out around about this time, and Jacques Cousteau, of course, was also instrumental in teaching Fleming about the underwater photography and diving and stuff. So they were acquaintances. Not sure how close they were,
Mm.
but they certainly knew each other. So these parts would be almost like science fiction to a reader in the 1950s.
Yeah, there was probably no real, yeah, you're right, no kind of visual representation. So, and things are always scarier when you can't, you can't actually see them. And quite literally in this scene, things are looming out the dark at Bond. This is again what you were saying about it being very gothic. This section is pure horror, I think.
And so when we get to the actual layer, and again, talking about Bond's many mistakes, I love the fact that they just go, "Oh, we just saw your air bubbles." It's something that Bond himself like anticipates. He's like, "Oh, I hope they're not looking because they'll be able to see my air bubbles," and they're like, "Yeah, we saw them." Um, he is sort of brought into a something which is so recognizably a villain's layer
Mm-hmm.
that I kind of have to sort of slap myself a few times to make myself realize that this is maybe the first time we've seen something like this in Fleming. Certainly it's not in Casino Royale. In Casino Royale, he's taken to sort of a deserted farmhouse. And here he's taken to something like a sort of a grotto, a cave, but it's been built into the landscape, and it's being used almost like as an industrial way of melting down the gold and getting rid of it.
I totally agree. I mean, several cultural commentators, including Sir Christopher Frayling, again another fan of Leone westerns,
I love his
but
work.
Christopher Frayling has said that the strongest Bond stories are those which have the archetype of the villain. Sorry, the hero, the hero having to enter the. We've created a new word.
Is it a word? It is
For an
now.
anti-hero, a villain. There you go. So where the hero has to go into the villain's lair because that's essentially their home, and that ties in with so many kind of classic myths and legends and folk stories. So there's something very archetypal about that. And yet, as you've said, the first Bond book doesn't have that. It doesn't have a villain's lair, whereas the next three Bond books do have a villain's lair. And that really is only established by Live and Let Die.
So, I mean, we've got some archetypes here that will run through the rest of the series, but they're being created sort of book by book, if you like, or chapter by chapter in this case. Then we have sort of what feels to me like almost like an old-fashioned silent movie moment of, the clock is ticking, the train is
Mhm.
coming, the damsel is tied to the tracks, and will the hero turn up? But in this case, it's the hero and the damsel are tied together, and they're being dragged towards the shallow coral, which will rip them to shreds, with the hope that the limpet mine will go off in time to save them. And again, there's a weird passivity about this scene in Bond. I mean, there's not much he can do.
No, and you're right. It is a ticking clock, and I think again, this really, really puts you through the mill. This is why I think this is the most exciting Fleming Bond book, because Bond is actually he's actually not able to influence the outcome a lot of the time. It's his actions prior to this, as you say, the limpet mine, which will hopefully save the day. But there's absolutely no guarantees to it, and it is. And again, as someone who doesn't like water very much, if you have anyone who hasn't actually read this book yet and is listening to this podcast, then it is replicated in the film of For Your Eyes Only, pretty much, not quite in such a harrowing fashion, but the film does a really decent job of it. But yeah, it's not the kind of going gung ho, guns blazing finale that people might associate with James Bond.
I mean, he's had that earlier in the book when he's escaping from
Mm.
Harlem. He's really quite good at shooting people
Yeah,
and
yeah,
getting
shoots
out
his
there.
way out. Yeah,
Yeah, and sort of knock somebody, down the staircase, and that sort of thing is excellent. But for the latter part of the book, and especially this final act, he's really, I mean, he saves Solitaire just in terms of, getting the after the explosion. That's where he has to sort of be
yeah.
more
Mm.
active, shall we say?
And if you think about, if you've not read the first four Fleming Bond books, just kind of maybe skip ahead for the next minute. But this is actually something that happens in all four of those books as well. So as we've already mentioned, the end of Casino Royale, Bond is tied to a chair, completely naked, with his testicles having been smashed. Pleasant. And he's the most vulnerable he possibly can be, and has to be saved by a Smersh agent. And then in Moonraker, Bond's about to blow himself up to be able to destroy the villain's missile, until the girl says, "Hang on, there's a better way, James. We don't all have to die." And then and she reprograms the missile, and Bond has to go, "Oh yeah, pretty good." And then you've got Diamonds Forever, where he's beaten to a pulp again, and it's the girl who comes and rescues him and says, "Right, let's get on this hand cart and get out of here." So Bond is not he isn't that guns blazing character at the ends of these stories. You're right, there are moments where he's very active elsewhere in the stories, but when it comes to those finales, Fleming is a master of making us really think, oh, he might not actually get out of this.
And he needs a Deus Ex Machina. He needs someone else to come
Yeah.
in and help him. And I think it's really interesting that there's a point at which he loses agency. There's this idea, the
Mm-hmm.
secret agent is not the agent of the
Mm-hmm.
final act of, as you say, many of these books.
Mm-hmm.
And the final fate of Mr. Big as well is a gruesome and wonderful sort of turning of. I mean, we've already had that a little bit played out in miniature with Robber being sort of hoisted by his own petard or dropped by his own
Mm-hmm.
trapdoor. And so you have that thing, you were going to kill me with this, and now you're going to be killed by this. So Mr. Big is eaten by sharks and barracudas, and the description of this is detailed and sort of darkly humorous.
And I think it's really genius of Fleming to um, he starts so many sentences with "the head moves towards Bond." The head, the head. So the surging head came nearer. Bond could almost hear the great diseased heart thumping under the grey black skin, and it's that tension of Bond really can't do anything to influence the outcome here. So Big is just splashing around trying to get towards him. And then ultimately a shark takes him under the water. And then we're told the head floated back to the surface. And then there's a horrible scrunch. and then silence. It's like, ugh. So he's almost sort of dismembered before he becomes dismembered by the shark. That focus on the head all the time, and that's all Bond can kind of focus on. And you could, and Bond is just so nerve wracked because he can't really do anything. He's having to keep him in solitaire afloat. They're injured. So fortunately, intelligence actually wins the day. They're not flapping around like Mr. Big in the water. So the sharks go for him rather than them, which I think is a brilliant finale.
Yeah, they don't panic. I mean, maybe that's
Yeah.
foreshadowed with the dream. He's already had his panic, so he doesn't need
Yeah.
to. He's been prepared.
Mm.
And there's a lovely is the wrong word, but delicious maybe description of him not having a hand or a wrist or a wristwatch. And I think again, Umberto Eco pointed that to that particular line as evidence of Fleming's Sardian qualities and his I mean, I remember reading sort of quotes on the back of Pan books and various, and it would always say, wonderful sadistic fun. And sometimes the sadistic actually goes right back to the Marquis de Sade and is very direct, I think.
I always used to love those quotes on the back of the paperback editions. The one that always stood out to me, and I'm not actually certain. Oh, it's actually right on the back of my copy that I've got right here. First ever copy of Live and Let Die I had, which I think is the version you're reading, the Pan one,
exactly,
with
yeah,
the
beautiful
skeleton fingers and the coins. So it was a Sunday Times review that said speed, tremendous zest, communicating excitement. It's the one that finishes with how wincingly well Mr. Fleming writes. But as kind of dated as some of that language is, I think it's so right about it being zesty.
Yeah.
I think there's so many parts that the Fleming always uses uncanny imagery, things that really almost oxymoronic at times. But this has some of the zestiest writing. It's like, ooh, that's it. Ooh, that's tart as you're reading the sentence, but it's kind of delicious, as you said, at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I really, and I would use that as well as an argument in favor of the sort of how beautiful he writes about Jamaica. There's this sense of a zest for life, right there and then. So the conclusion of you sort of have the something that the films will very much pick up on, the sort of like when the smoke has cleared, what a solitaire, and they're going to have some leave. They're probably going to extend their relationship a bit, and you have what the films pick up and reproduce, that sort of pre-coital / post-coital moment of like, we're going to now I get my reward.
I agree. I think there are some subtle differences. You do get, so Bond is obviously very injured at the end of this story, as he usually is at the ends of one of these stories. He's even lost a mouthful of muscle at his shoulder from a barracuda bite, which sounds incredibly painful. He takes care of Solitaire first, cleans her off. But there is very much a sense of the woman being in charge, which, if you think about the ending of Octopussy, the film, when he's in a weakened state, he's got his leg in a cast and his arm, and I think we're led to believe that he's kind of faking it for some reason, or he's just going to kind of push himself through the pain barrier to be able to have coitus with Octopussy. But I'm always really interested that the novels again make the woman the person who's in charge. The probably most extreme version of this is the end of Doctor No, where in the book, Honey basically tells Bond to she orders him to take all his clothes off. So she's the one in charge. She's definitely in charge. In this one, Bond's saying, I shan't be able to make love with only one arm. And then she says something about various positions making it more accessible. So she again is the one who's kind of leading Bond rather than the other way around, which I think he's for the most part the other way around in the films.
But in a way, I think that also speaks to something which, I mean, if you think about the anatomical detail of that passage, he's obviously thinking of making love as basically being missionary position.
Yes.
And she's going, well, what about if I go on top?
Exactly.
You don't need to use your arm at all.
You could probably tell from the way I was talking about it, John, that I was trying to avoid being quite so direct, but that is exactly what's going on here. Yeah.
You're so coy, David.
I know.
But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I mean, that shows him up to be to some degree, and it shows Ian Fleming's awareness of him as well as
Mm-hmm.
being a somewhat coy conservative figure that,
Mm-hmm.
the people, the world that he's meeting is much more interesting, exciting than that, and he ought to, get with the program. This. You shouldn't limit your life. You've got these opportunities, seize them.
I think there's a really good example of this much earlier in the book as well, where I think Bond himself is probably not although he's probably got a lot of sexual experience in terms of numbers of conquests, although Fleming, of course, famously had to defend Bond having a woman a year when he went on to Desert Island Discs towards the end of his life. But we tend to associate Bond with having multiple partners. But I think he's probably quite sexually vanilla, James Bond, to be perfectly honest. And there's a really I think it's quite revealing in multiple senses when Bond goes to the nightclub with Felix at the start of towards the start of Live and Let Die, and there's a naked dancer, and there's very much a sense of, and it's not just to do with the ethnicities of the patrons, but there's very much a sense of Bond being really out of his comfort zone in that environment, and it's like, what could happen next? So yeah, that's another example of Bond really kind of being out of his depth, and definitely when it comes to sexuality as well.
I really got a feeling in that. I remember that reading that, and I had a feeling that he was probably putting the menu card somewhere
Yeah.
to sort of cover his growing admiration for what he was seeing. It was utterly, it was utterly, yeah. It had a sort of almost Mr. Beanie element to it.
I don't think Bond is actually the most adventurous in the bedroom. Bless him.
Oh dear, oh dear. Okay, right, let's wrap up with 007 things we learned from Live and Let Die. Now, we did start a sort of list,
Mm,
but and I'm willing for us to sort of, we don't have to stick to seven necessarily, but maybe I can do one and you can do one, and
okay.
some of these might be slightly. Well, one thing that I wanted to do, actually, I'll make this my number one. Do we have scrambled eggs in this book?
Oh, now that's a really good point. We definitely have eggs.
Hmm.
I don't know if specifically they are scrambled. I would
I
have
think
to
he has
go back and check.
poached eggs at one point, but they're not
Um,
called poached. They're called something else.
yeah,
But it's basically,
he does eat a lot of pork and eggs as usual. It
mm.
wouldn't be a Bond novel without that.
I think he might
Um,
have some in Florida, I've got a feeling he has some.
I think you may be right. That does ring a bell, yeah.
I feel like in future editions, I'm going to sort of circle the page number of the scrambled eggs.
Oh God, I actually went through and made a list of all the egg references once, and there are so many more than you even think there are in Fleming.
Yeah.
He was absolutely obsessed.
I don't know why, but maybe it's just I think there's just a bit of when I'm writing, there are certain things that if you just mention a word, it's like if you read the word yawn, it's almost impossible not to yawn. And I think if you mention something like, chopping onions or having some scrambled eggs, it's almost impossible for people not to go, there's nobody in the world who hasn't eaten scrambled eggs, so you immediately get it. Okay. So number one, scrambled eggs, question mark. Number two, your turn, David.
I'm gonna go with brightly colored outfits are clearly the best way to blend in. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, if we can take any advice for life from James Bond, that's definitely well, no, clearly doesn't really work out very well here. But I always get a bit annoyed about James Bond being really conservatively dressed. He basically wears blue, and that's it. Not very adventurous, which actually compared with Fleming. So Fleming himself, as we know, was a very even though it was blue with white polka dots like Churchill's, he was fond of a bow tie. And actually, you look at some of what Fleming was wearing, and you could totally wear that today, and that would still appear quite avant-garde today. So there's the white kind of safari jacket. I love that picture of Fleming. So Fleming himself was actually quite a snappy dresser in some ways. So I always find it a bit mystifying that Bond isn't. very much of a snappy dresser. Not in my world anyway. I purposely only wear bright clothing most of the time, because life's too short, just to kind of wear black and blue all the time. But yeah, this is a rare occasion where Bond actually gets to do some dressing up.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. I love that. I love that idea. And yeah, he always dresses in sort of, there's always a knitted tie, and I always find myself thinking, what's a knitted tie exactly? Is that like,
I
did your
actually,
grandma knit a tie or something?
yeah, I mainly wear knitted ties because,
Ah,
to be perfectly honest, for work.
mm.
There's nothing against a knitted tie, but wear some different colours, James.
Yeah, come on. There's a whole rainbow out there,
I know.
spectrum. Okay, so I'll do number three. I'll go with How to Be American. I thought I
Mm,
loved just this idea that Americans were so unusual that you'd have
mm,
to actually learn how to speak like them. And it's got
hmm
him pronouncing certain words and saying, I'm not going to say this, I'm going to say this instead, and I'm not going to say, pavement, I'm going to say sidewalk. And you can imagine British readers reading this and going, oh, okay. And American readers going, what is he on? You know, and we've got to mention the fact that, Fleming wanted an American readership. And so you
hmm
mentioned earlier that he wanted to kill Felix Leiter in the original draft of the book. And his American publisher persuaded him not to because
mm,
he needed the American readership for
mm,
this to be as economically successful as possible. So I
mm.
love that uh, strange mixture of resentment and admiration that Fleming and Bond both have for the Americans.
My next one's going to lead on from that because I always love it when Fleming tries to use slang terms from any milieu really, but particularly when it comes to gangsters. So when they bomb the train, they throw in a pineapple in this, and there's so many different words for different kinds of explosives, and Fleming really relishes using those. He also does it in, if you've ever read, have you ever read Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, the children's story?
No, I've seen
So
the
he does it
film,
in
and
that as well, but it's obviously British gangster slang. So he talks about gangsters using jelly for gelignite, and he loves like criminal argot. He loves using that sort of vocabulary. That's always something I clock, and it's particularly relevant here. You've got the Americanisms, as you've noted there, but also lots of gangster speech.
yes, exactly. And as soon as he gets to Florida, somebody mentions oldsters, and Bond won't stop using the word. Oh, here are some more oldsters, and there's another oldster. And he's like, "All right, okay, we get it. You've learned a new word, James. Shut up." Okay, and so the next one, which I think we're on, what, number five now? Well,
Five, yeah.
I wanted to reiterate the 007's feelings about luck and flying. I think
Mm,
that's well worth underlining because I thought it was just so well written, and such a fascinating insight into kind of the difference. And this might have something to do with the difference between reading a book and watching a film. It's difficult to
mm,
get to the
mm,
interiority
yeah.
of someone like Sean Connery or Roger Moore. They're very much playing icons rather than playing people. And
Mm,
well, certainly more so with Moore than Connery. But with the literary Bond, there is a real sense that this guy is nervous, and this guy is often out of his depth, and this guy is often overcoming not only villains but his own inadequacies, his own inability
mm,
to do stuff.
mm. Yeah, totally. And again, my next one connects with yours. But James Bond is not a good sleeper. I think that's one of the as a lifelong insomniac. Or someone who's had sleep issues. Again, this is one of the things I relate. Probably one of the less spoken about aspects of James Bond is James Bond does not sleep very well. And for a start, from Casino Royale onwards, he's going to bed at 3 a.m., which probably isn't helping. But here he actually does talk about 9 p.m. Sorry, being a reasonable bedtime for himself. But also we've already talked about the nightmares about the killer fish. He also, one of my favorite parts of the book is on the train when he hears through his dreams the measured clang of warning bells. There's that sense throughout this whole book of that impending doom, and those thoughts start intruding in James Bond's sleep a lot. He actually only gets a good night's sleep when he actually gets to Jamaica after he's physically exhausted. And I think that's an overlooked element of the James Bond character. You don't really get it in the films. You get sense he always has a really good night's sleep. Whereas in the books, if you pay attention to how little James Bond sleeps and how difficult he finds it, that's something I think that needs more attention.
And that might explain the pots of coffee and the
Hmm.
stimulants that he's
Yeah,
constantly on. He's
Benzedrine. Because why not? Just
absolutely.
before going on a mission, why not take Benzedrine? Essentially an upper, and is it whiskey he takes it with? Or rum? I can't. It's a heavy spirit anyway. He does
It,
this all the time, and
in
in one of
Moonraker,
the,
he pours it into champagne and
I know.
causing M to go, oh, well, for goodness sake, James, what are you doing? A Benzedrine, sir.
I would love a James Bond film to be called Champagne and Benzedrine Never Again. After the after that line where Bond wakes up with the worst hangover imaginable, and just like he doesn't learn his lesson though.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I love that. That's such a great read, that book. And I think we've got one more finally. Do you want to choose the last one?
Mm. Oh, I can't choose between the two. Should we talk about voodoo
Yeah, let's do
to
that.
finish with? Let's do voodoo. So I learnt all I know about voodoo. I learnt when I was writing a very long article about the Live and Let Die film, and discovered all the different branches of voodoo. And I think it's quite clear here that Fleming himself did quite a lot of research, as he always did, into every topic. And what did you make of the treatment of voodoo in here? Because I'm no voodoo expert, I'll be honest, but to me, as ever with Fleming, it probably isn't extremely accurate, but it reads authoritatively.
Yeah, I felt that it also connected to sort of like early cinema treatments of voodoo, like White
Yeah.
Zombie, and I there was a little bit of me that was thinking of it as there's that exotic sort of
Mm,
feel to it, which it's very easy to dismiss again,
mm,
but um, it's I find it kind of compelling and spooky and
mm,
interesting, and it goes into much more detail here than it's if he was going to be just a sort of racist. Ooh, they have weird ideas. Then
yeah.
it wouldn't need to go into such
No.
detail. It wouldn't be as fascinated by it as it obviously is.
I think Fleming wants us to almost kind of buy into that, all of the superstitious elements are kind of real. But then again, he's even got his character of Solitaire, who doesn't believe in voodoo, but is fearful of it all the same. And Bond himself almost that he starts to fear it as well, even though they're trying to rationalize it all the way through. So I think the speed of this book is so brilliant because so many things happen, and this happens all the time in Fleming. So he often begins in media res, but particularly with the voodoo stuff, things happen, and then characters reflect on how voodoo's affected them. So Solitaire is raised in that tradition, but we don't find this out until much later and how she came to that. And it's kind of terrifying, really, once you've got to know the character and then you find out all these things that have gone on in her past. So it's almost like she's kind of gone past that, really. But it's a weird mix, isn't it? He kind of wants you to kind of Fleming wants to have his cake and eat it. He wants you to buy into voodoo, but at all the same time realize how it's being used as a tool, and that actually we shouldn't be believing in it. So I think it's a really clever mix.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting how she has the more complex, nuanced idea of it as well, more so
Mm,
than even Bond does.
mm,
That she's, I'm basically doing a mind reading act,
yeah,
but there is also this thing that it has this certain power which is
yeah.
slightly inexplicable. That's an amazing conversation. I really loved talking about this book. It was a great book to reread. Already having read Casino Royale just last week, I was my there was a little bit of me when I started thinking of doing a series of thinking, okay, this is going to be good fun here and there, but there is going to be some sloggy moments. But this has been so far absolutely wonderful. I love these two books. I think they're
Mm.
really they're really fascinating.
They're great, aren't they? I think these first four in particular are really, because my favorite three Bond books are Casino Royale, Live and Let Die, and You Only Live Twice, which is a
Right.
whole other world of weird. You Only Live Twice. It's like, whoa, what's going on here? And that's probably actually my favorite Bond book overall. But as I've said a few times on this, I find Live and Let Die just so exciting. If I want something that's just going to be full of tension and we've got the food, we've got the drinks, all the kind of superficial lifestyle-y type things about Bond are in here, but it's got something deeper going on as well, and it's just a damn good thriller as well.
Yeah, I'm 100% behind you on that, and I think it's a little bit longer than Casino Royale, and he
It
manages
is.
to sustain it.
Mm,
It's not just brevity that is making this quick and giving it pace. That pace is right in the writing and in the
mm.
structure of it and everything. So thank you so much for joining me, David. It's been a real pleasure, real treat.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me on.